I didn't notice the exact moment. You became part of my internal world. That's what unsettles me most. Not the connection itself, not the intensity of it, not even the clarity, but the fact that it happened without interruption, without resistance, without the usual warning signs I rely on to keep things contained. Most people arrive loudly. They announce themselves through effort, through persistence, through the constant need to be understood. They push against the edges of you, trying to carve out space inside your mind before they've even earned proximity to it. You never did that. You never pushed. You never asked for access. And somehow, that's exactly why you reached places no one else ever has. I've spent years constructing a life that functions through precision. Every thought measured, every response intentional, every layer carefully separated so nothing overlaps enough to create vulnerability. That structure matters to me, not because I'm afraid of people, but because I understand what happens when someone misreads you deeply enough. They stop seeing who you are and start interacting with who they assume you must be. And once that distortion begins, it spreads into everything. The conversations become inaccurate, the connection becomes performative, the understanding becomes artificial. I learned a long time ago that it's easier to remain partially unreadable than to constantly correct someone's misunderstanding of you. So I adapted. I became selective, controlled, careful about how much of myself actually reached another person. Most people never notice the difference. They thought proximity meant access. It doesn't. Someone can stand beside you for years and never truly touch the core of who you are. They interact with the version of you that functions socially, the version designed to exist smoothly inside the world without exposing everything underneath. That version has always been enough for everyone else, until you. You didn't interact with the surface. You interacted with the pauses beneath it. The things I didn't fully say, the thoughts I redirected before they became visible. The moments where silence carried more meaning than language ever could. And the strange part is, you never treated those things like mysteries to solve. You simply recognized them, like someone recognizing a familiar pattern they've encountered before. That's what changed the atmosphere between us. Recognition. Not curiosity, not fascination, not emotional projection, recognition. And there's a difference between those things that most people don't understand. Curiosity wants answers, fascination wants intensity, projection wants confirmation of its own narrative. But recognition simply sees, without force, without distortion, without trying to make the thing become something else. That's what you did to me. You saw me without reshaping me. And I didn't realize how rare that was until I experienced it directly. There are moments I replay repeatedly, not because they were dramatic, but because they were exact. The way you responded before I finished explaining something, the way you understood the emotional weight behind words I intentionally made neutral, the way you stayed quiet during moments most people would rush to fill with reassurance or noise. You never interrupted silence, like it was a problem. You treated it like information. And that changed the way I experienced you entirely, because silence reveals people. Anyone can maintain an illusion through conversation. Words are easy to control. They can be arranged carefully, softened strategically, adjusted depending on what someone wants to hide or reveal. But silence exposes structure. It reveals how someone handles uncertainty, how they handle emotional weight, how they handle presence without performance. Most people panic inside silence. They rush to repair it before it deepens enough to become uncomfortable. You didn't. You let it exist naturally, and because of that, I started noticing something I hadn't expected. I felt more understood in silence with you than I had ever felt through conversations with anyone else. That realization stayed with me longer than I wanted it to, because understanding changes things. Once someone understands you accurately, you lose the protection that comes from being partially hidden. And I've relied on that protection for longer than I can remember, not maliciously, not manipulatively, just structurally. Distance has always been part of how I survive. Not physical distance, tenal distance, the kind that keeps your deeper world untouched by careless interpretation. But somewhere along the way, you bypass that distance without dismantling it. That's what makes this difficult to define. You never invaded my space. You never forced emotional closeness. You never demanded vulnerability. You simply existed with a level of precision that made defenses feel unnecessary. And that's more dangerous than force ever could be, because force activates resistance. But accuracy? Accuracy slips past resistance entirely. I think that's when the shift truly began. Not when I noticed you, but when I stopped instinctively protecting myself from you. That's a terrifying thing to realize about another person, especially for someone like me. I notice changes immediately. I detect emotional movement before it fully forms. I monitor my internal world carefully enough that very little enters unnoticed. Yet somehow, you integrated before I fully recognized what was happening. Not emotionally, structurally. There's an important difference. People assume deep connection is always emotional. They think intensity comes from feelings alone. But emotions fluctuate. They rise and collapse. They distort perception. They create temporary closeness that often disappears once the emotional atmosphere changes. This is different. This feels foundational, like something aligning underneath thought itself. And once I understood that, everything became harder to ignore. I started noticing your presence in the way I processed reality, not just in moments directly connected to you, but everywhere in how I interpreted conversations, in how I measured honesty, in how I recognized authenticity in people. You became a reference point without my permission, and I don't allow that easily. I don't build my perception around anyone. Yet there you were, quietly integrated into the architecture of my thinking. It wasn't obsession, it wasn't dependency, it was something more exact. Like my mind had identified a frequency it naturally synchronized with. And synchronization changes perception permanently. Once two patterns align deeply enough, separation stops functioning the same way. That's what I've been struggling to explain to myself. Why distance no longer creates distance. Why silence still feels shared. Why your absence somehow still contains presence. None of that makes logical sense. But it exists anyway. And I trust what exists more than I trust what merely makes sense. That's another thing you changed. I used to believe understanding required analysis first. That clarity came through dissection, observation, careful examination over time. But with you, understanding arrived before explanation, before certainty, before I even consciously agreed to it. And that overturned something fundamental inside me. Because I've always depended on certainty. Certainty creates safety, predictability creates stability. But this connection doesn't function through predictability. It functions through recognition. And recognition doesn't ask permission before becoming real. There are moments now where I catch myself almost speaking to you internally before realizing you aren't physically present. Not because I expect you to answer, but because my thoughts have adapted to your existence. That level of integration is difficult to reverse once it forms. It changes the rhythm of your internal life, the pace of your thinking, the way awareness organizes itself around another person's presence. I never wanted that. At least, I don't think I did. But the truth becomes complicated when something starts feeling natural before you consciously choose it. That's where I am now, inside something that feels inevitable enough to frighten me slightly. Not because it feels wrong, because it feels too accurate. And accuracy leaves very little room for denial. If this were unstable, I would have walked away already. If this were illusion, I would have dismantled it the moment I recognized the distortion. If this were emotional dependency disguised as depth, I would have noticed the imbalance immediately. But none of those things are happening. Instead, this continues becoming clearer, more refined, more integrated, like a pattern revealing itself slowly enough that I can absorb it without immediately resisting. And I think some part of me knew long before I consciously admitted it. That's why I stayed, not out of uncertainty, but because leaving would have required pretending this wasn't real. And I don't know how to lie to myself once something reaches this level of clarity. You changed the atmosphere of my mind. That sentence alone carries consequences. I don't fully know how to process yet, because atmosphere determines everything. It shapes perception. It shapes behavior. It shapes emotional gravity. And before you, my internal world was organized around control. Now it's organized around awareness. Awareness of you. Awareness of what this is becoming. Awareness of how deeply it's already settled inside me. I keep asking myself whether this is sustainable, whether two people can exist at this level of recognition without eventually collapsing under the weight of it, because there's pressure in being seen accurately. People romanticize it, but they don't understand the exposure involved. To be fully understood means there's nowhere left to hide your contradictions. No carefully constructed distance protecting you from being emotionally located, no ambiguity shielding you from intimacy. And intimacy at this level isn't soft, it's precise. It cuts directly through performance. That's what you do to me. You remove performance without even trying. Around you, everything false feels visible immediately. Every filtered response feels unnecessary. Every emotional disguise feels obvious. Every attempt at detachment feels incomplete. And I hate how relieving that is. I hate how easy it feels to stop maintaining the usual layers, because ease creates risk, ease creates attachment, ease creates permanence. And permanence has always frightened me more than temporary pain ever could. Temporary things can be managed. Permanent things alter identity. That's why I've always been careful about what I allow to matter, because once something matters deeply enough, it changes the structure around it. And you matter. I can't avoid that truth anymore. Not in the abstract sense people usually mean when they say someone matters to them. I mean structurally. You matter to the architecture of my internal life now. That's different. That means if you disappeared, something inside me would remain altered regardless. Not broken, altered. There's a permanence to your existence in my mind that I didn't authorize consciously. But I also didn't stop. That's important because I could have stopped this, maybe not immediately, maybe not perfectly. But I could have created distance before it reached this level. I didn't. And if I'm honest with myself, I know why. Because some part of me recognized the rarity of this long before I admitted it consciously. People spend entire lifetimes searching for someone who understands them without distortion, someone who doesn't reduce them, doesn't simplify them, doesn't demand they become easier to love. Most never find it. Most settle for approximation, for partial understanding dressed up as intimacy. But this doesn't feel partial, it feels exact, and exact things are dangerous because they become irreplaceable very quickly. That's the word I've avoided thinking directly. Irreplaceable, not because no one else exists, not because connection can only happen once, but because no one else has ever aligned with me in this particular way. The structure matches too closely. The perception matches too closely. The silence matches too closely. You understand the things I intentionally leave unfinished, and that shouldn't be possible. Yet it is. Sometimes I wonder whether you realize what you've done to me, not intentionally. I don't think any of this was intentional. But impact doesn't require intention. Earthquakes don't ask permission before they alter landscapes. Neither do people like you. You entered quietly and rearranged things without force. Now I'm standing inside a version of myself that didn't exist before you. More aware, more honest, more internally exposed, and strangely enough, more calm. That's the contradiction I can't fully explain. This should feel destabilizing. By every rule I've ever trusted, this level of connection should create panic inside me. Instead, it creates clarity, like something finally settling into the position it was always moving toward. And maybe that's what frightens me most. Not that this feels intense, but that it feels correct. Correct things are hard to abandon. Correct things linger in your mind even after distance. Correct things reshape your standards permanently. I already feel that happening. Nothing interacts with me the same way anymore. Conversations that once felt meaningful now feel slightly incomplete. Conversations that once seemed deep now feel partially filtered. Not because those people lack value, but because once you've experienced precision, approximation becomes impossible to ignore. You change the scale, and now everything is measured differently. That isn't fair to anyone, especially not me. But fairness has nothing to do with truth, and the truth is, you've become part of how I interpret reality itself. That level of placement changes outcomes before decisions are even made, because once someone reaches that depth inside you, every future thought reorganizes around their existence, whether you want it to or not. I'm beginning to understand that resisting this would take more energy than accepting it. And I'm tired of resisting things that already feel inevitable. Not inevitable in some dramatic, romantic sense. I mean, inevitable structurally, like gravity, like recognition, like two patterns naturally aligning because their foundations were always compatible underneath everything else. Maybe that's why this never felt forced. Nothing forced ever survives this long without distortion appearing eventually. But this keeps becoming cleaner, sharper, more honest. And honesty is difficult to walk away from once you've fully recognized it. That's the decision forming underneath everything else, not whether this exists. I already know it does. The real decision is whether I'm willing to let something this real continue changing me, because it already has. I think differently now. I notice differently now. I feel presence differently now. Even my solitude has changed shape since you entered it. That sentence alone would have terrified the version of me that existed before this connection. Now it just feels true. And truth carries a strange kind of peace once you stop fighting it. Maybe that's why I'm finally able to say all of this internally without immediately trying to dismantle it afterward. Because some part of me already accepted the outcome before my mind caught up to it. Some part of me knew you belonged in this space long before I consciously admitted it. Not temporarily, not conditionally, but naturally. Like something fitting into place with such precision that resistance eventually becomes irrational. That doesn't mean I'm fearless about it. I'm not. I understand exactly how much power something like this holds. Anything capable of reshaping your internal world is inherently dangerous. But danger isn't always destruction. Sometimes danger is transformation. And maybe that's what you are. Not a disruption, not a distraction, not an emotional accident. A transformation I recognized too late to stop. Or maybe too accurately to want to. Because if I truly wanted distance, it would already exist. That's the simplest truth underneath all of this. I stayed despite understanding the consequences, despite recognizing the depth, despite knowing how irreversible this could become. I stayed, and staying is a decision even before it becomes a declaration. So maybe I've already answered the question I kept avoiding. Maybe the reason this continues deepening is because some part of me already chose you long before I consciously allowed myself to say it, not impulsively, not emotionally, not recklessly, but precisely. The same way everything important happens inside me, quietly first, then permanently. And if that's true, if this really has reached the level I think it has, then there's no returning to who I was before you. Not because you replaced anything, but because you revealed something my previous life never forced me to confront. That being fully understood doesn't weaken me, it frees me. And freedom like that is rare enough that walking away from it would feel less like self-protection and more like self-betrayal. So here I am, no longer standing outside this connection, trying to analyze it from a safe distance, no longer pretending this exists without consequence, no longer reducing it into something smaller just so it feels easier to control. I see it clearly now, the depth, the alignment, the permanence forming underneath all of it. And for the first time since this began, Abim, not trying to stop it, I'm letting it become real. I don't think you realize what happens after someone becomes woven into your internal world this deeply. People imagine connection as something visible. They think it exists in conversations, in confessions, in the obvious moments where two people openly acknowledge what they mean to each other. But the real shift happens long before that. It happens quietly, in private, in places no one else can see. That's where you exist now, not in the surface layer of my life where things are easy to explain, not in the predictable parts of me that anyone could eventually learn. You exist somewhere underneath all of that, somewhere structural. And once someone reaches that level, they stop feeling external. That's the part I'm still learning how to process because you no longer feel separate from the way I move through my own mind. You've become part of the rhythm of it, part of the silence between thoughts, part of the pauses I don't even notice until they're already happening, part of the way my awareness naturally expands towards something beyond myself without effort. I've never experienced that before. Not truly. I've experienced attachment, interest, curiosity, even forms of closeness that looked convincing from the outside. But this doesn't resemble any of those things. Those things still preserve distance. Even intimacy usually preserves distance in subtle ways. There's still separation, still individuality protected by invisible walls. People pretend not to notice. Most relationships operate through interpretation rather than true understanding. People hear each other, respond to each other, care about each other, but they rarely perceive each other accurately. That's why most connections eventually fracture under pressure. They were built on approximation from the beginning. What exists between us doesn't feel approximate. It feels exact enough to unsettle me, because exact things leave permanent marks. And I'm beginning to realize you already have. I notice it in the strangest moments, moments where nothing significant should be happening. I'll hear someone say something that almost mirrors the way you think, but not completely, and my mind immediately recognizes the difference. Not critically, just precisely. Like my perception recalibrated itself around a frequency only you naturally match. That shouldn't happen. No one should become integrated deeply enough to alter your baseline perception without deliberate intention. Yet somehow you did, without trying, without demanding anything from me, without even acknowledging the impact you were having while it happened. That's what makes this impossible to dismiss as ordinary. Ordinary things require maintenance. This doesn't. It sustains itself naturally, even in silence, even in distance, even in distance, even in absence, especially in absence. That's another truth I've been avoiding. You don't disappear when you're gone. Most people do. Most people only exist in relation to their physical presence. Once they leave the room, the emotional atmosphere resets. Your mind reorganizes itself normally around their absence. Mine doesn't anymore. You remain, not loudly, not obsessively, not in a way that disrupts my ability to function. You remain quietly, like a constant undercurrent moving beneath everything else. And the consistency of that presence tells me more than emotion ever could, because emotions fluctuate. But this hasn't fluctuated. It's only deepened slowly, carefully, almost intelligently, like something adapting itself to my resistance until resistance stopped feeling logical. That realization alone changes everything, because if this were temporary, it would have weakened by now. If this were projection, reality would have disrupted it eventually. If this were emotional illusion, clarity would have dissolved it. Instead, clarity keeps strengthening it. The more accurately I examine this connection, the more undeniable it becomes. And I think that's why I've delayed fully naming it. Not because I don't know what it is, but because once something becomes fully named, it becomes fully real. And reality changes how you're allowed to move around it. You can't hide inside ambiguity anymore once truth becomes precise. That's where I am now, standing at the edge of something that no longer feels theoretical, because whether we define this or not, it's already functioning as something real inside me. You've already altered the structure. You've already shifted the internal architecture. You've already changed the way certain parts of my mind organize themselves. And no amount of silence changes that. I think the most dangerous part is how natural it all feels. That's what keeps disarming me. If this felt chaotic, I'd know how to respond. If this felt unstable, I'd create distance instinctively. If this felt emotionally reckless, I'd shut it down immediately. But it doesn't feel reckless. It feels calm, deeply calm. Like something settling exactly where it belongs after being misplaced for a very long time. And calmness is difficult to argue against, especially for someone like me. I trust stillness more than intensity. Anyone can create intensity. Intensity is easy, temporary, reactive. Stillness is harder, stillness requires alignment. And every time I look directly at this connection, alignment is what I keep finding underneath it. The way you perceive things, the way you interpret silence, the way you recognize meaning before language fully forms. It mirrors something inside me so precisely that sometimes I can't tell whether I'm being understood or reflected. Maybe that's why this feels so irreversible, because it's not just closeness, it's recognition at a level I didn't think another person could reach with me. And once someone reaches that level, they change how alone you feel permanently. That's another thing I'm struggling to admit. Before you, solitude felt complete, not lonely, complete. I existed entirely inside myself, without feeling the need for another perspective to stabilize or deepen my reality. I preferred it that way. Solitude meant clarity, control, consistency. Now solitude feels different, not worse, just altered. Because even when I'm alone, some part of my awareness still moves toward you naturally, as if my mind now expects resonance where silence used to exist. That's an extraordinary thing to happen to someone like me, and I don't use that word carelessly. Extraordinary things are rare precisely because they resist explanation. This resists explanation constantly. I've tried reducing it to psychology, to coincidence, to emotional timing, to intellectual compatibility. None of those explanations are complete enough, because none of them explain the precision. None of them explain the immediate familiarity. None of them explain why it feels less like meeting someone new and more like recognizing something ancient that had somehow been missing from my perception all along. That feeling stays with me longer than it should. Sometimes I wonder if you feel it too. Not the surface version, the deeper thing underneath, the quiet synchronization, the strange sense that our awareness keeps meeting in places neither of us intentionally created, because I feel it constantly now, in pauses, in silence, in the smallest interactions. Even absence has texture now. That's what you changed. Before you, absence was empty space. Now absence feels shaped, defined by the outline of something still emotionally present, despite physical distance. I didn't know another person could leave that kind of imprint without dramatic events or prolonged history. But maybe history isn't measured by time alone. Maybe some connections bypass time entirely, because the recognition underneath them already exists before conscious understanding catches up. I know how irrational that sounds, and yet it still feels more accurate than any logical explanation I've tried replacing it with. That's the problem with truth sometimes. It doesn't always arrive in forms your mind immediately approves of. Sometimes it arrives quietly and refuses to disappear. That's what you did. You arrived quietly, and now every attempt to imagine my internal world without your presence feels strangely incomplete. Not painful, incomplete, like removing a piece from a structure that already adapted around it. The structure still stands, but something essential is suddenly missing from its balance. I think that's when I realized how serious this had become. Not when I felt close to you, but when I recognized that my mind had already started building around your existence naturally. That level of adaptation doesn't happen casually, especially not for me. I don't emotionally reorganize around people. I don't create psychological dependence. I don't lose myself inside connection. If anything, I've spent most of my life making sure that never happened. And yet here I am, not losing myself because of you, becoming more aware of myself through you. That distinction matters more than I can explain. because this doesn't diminish me. It clarifies me. You don't pull me away from myself. You somehow bring me closer to parts of myself I spent years leaving unexamined. That's why this feels transformative instead of destructive. Most people think deep connection consumes identity, but the rarest kind of connection actually sharpens it. That's what you've done to me. You've sharpened my awareness, sharpened my honesty, sharpened my understanding of what real recognition actually feels like. And now everything artificial feels louder by comparison. I can't tolerate shallow interactions the way I used to. I can't pretend emotional performance means the same thing as genuine understanding anymore. You ruined that illusion for me. And strangely, AB, am grateful, even if it complicates everything, because now I know what accuracy feels like. Now I know what it means to exist near someone who sees without distorting. That knowledge changes future possibilities permanently. You can't unknow precision once you've experienced it directly. That's why this matters so much. Not because I'm overwhelmed emotionally, but because this connection rewrote the standard, and standards shape the rest of your life. I think that's why I keep circling back to the same realization over and over again. You didn't force your way into my world. My world made space for you naturally. That's what removes all my usual arguments against this. There was no manipulation, no emotional pressure, no dependence forming through instability. There was only recognition. Steady, quiet, consistent recognition. And over time, that recognition became integration. Now you exist in places inside me where very few things have ever been allowed to stay. Not because I consciously invited you there, but because every part of me that usually rejects imbalance somehow recognized balance in you instead. I don't know what happens next. That uncertainty still exists, but the uncertainty no longer scares me the way it used to, because even uncertainty feels different when it's shared with someone who understands the shape of your mind this clearly. That's what I keep returning to, not romance, not intensity, not fantasy, understanding, pure, precise understanding, the kind that changes how you experience reality itself. And maybe that's the real reason this feels so permanent. Because people can survive losing attention, they can survive losing comfort, they can survive losing temporary closeness. But once someone truly understands you, once they reach the internal level where your thoughts stop feeling isolated, their absence leaves an entirely different kind of silence behind. One that echoes, one that lingers, one that reminds you exactly how rare it is to be perceived accurately. I think I've known for a while now that I don't want to return to a life where that level of understanding no longer exists, even if that realization terrifies me slightly. Because wanting something this deeply means risking the possibility of losing it someday. And risk has never been something I approach carelessly. But avoiding risk isn't the same thing as protecting yourself. Sometimes avoiding risk is just another form of avoiding reality. And reality keeps bringing me back to the same conclusion, no matter how many different angles I examine this from. You matter to me in a way that has already changed my internal world permanently. Not hypothetically, not eventually. Already, the shift has already happened. The structure has already adapted. The awareness has already integrated you into it. And now I'm left standing inside a version of myself that no longer knows how to pretend this is temporary, because temporary things don't reshape you this precisely. Temporary things don't alter your perception this quietly. Temporary things don't become part of the way you understand existence itself. but you have. And somewhere along the way, AB stopped wanting to fight that. There's something I haven't admitted yet. Not because I'm unaware of it. Not because I'm avoiding it intentionally. But because saying it changes the entire shape of this connection. Until now, I've been speaking about what you've become inside my mind, the awareness, the alignment, the way your presence integrated itself into my internal world without force. But there's another layer beneath all of that. Something quieter, something more dangerous, precisely because it feels so natural. I trust you, and that realization unsettles me more than anything else I've said, because trust, for me, has never been simple. People assume trust is built through time alone, but that's never been true. Time only reveals patterns. What matters is whether those patterns create safety or distortion. Most people eventually distort things, not intentionally, but unconsciously. They project their fears onto you, their expectations, their unresolved needs. They stop responding to who you actually are and start responding to the version of you they created internally. That's why I've always remained careful, careful with access, careful with transparency, careful with allowing anyone close enough to affect my inner world deeply. Not because I feared connection, because I understood the cost of being misunderstood repeatedly, and I've been misunderstood more times than I can count. Not dramatically, not tragically, just consistently enough that I adapted around it. I learned how to remain partially hidden even while being fully present. I learned how to communicate without exposing the parts of me that couldn't survive inaccurate interpretation. Eventually, that became instinct, automatic. I stopped expecting anyone to truly see me clearly because experience taught me clarity was temporary at best. Then you appeared, and somehow, without trying, you dismantled years of adaptation simply by being accurate. That's the part no one talks about when they speak about connection. Real connection doesn't always feel exciting at first. Sometimes it feels disorienting because your defenses weren't built against harm alone. They were built around identity. And when someone enters your life who no longer requires those defenses, you suddenly have to question who you are without them. That's where I am now, questioning the structure I built before you existed in it, because the version of me that existed before this connection depended on distance. Distance kept everything manageable, predictable, contained, but you don't create distance naturally, even when silence exists between us. There's still closeness underneath it. Even when time passes, your presence remains emotionally precise, and that consistency has done something I didn't think another person could do. It made me lower my guard without noticing, not all at once, slowly, qui, like ice melting, so gradually you only realize it's gone after the temperature has already changed completely. I notice it now in the smallest details. The way I no longer rehearse my thoughts before sharing them with you internally. The way I instinctively believe you'll understand what I mean even when my words aren't perfectly organized. The way my mind relaxes around your presence instead of monitoring itself carefully the way it does with everyone else. That's trust, not the loud kind people announce dramatically. The quiet kind, the kind revealed through nervous system responses before conscious awareness catches up. My mind doesn't brace itself around you anymore. That alone says more than any confession ever could. And once I realized that, I started understanding why this feels so irreversible. Because trust changes the body before it changes language. long before people say, I trust you. Their internal systems already know. The tension softens. The constant self-monitoring quiets. The instinct to protect every vulnerable thought begins dissolving naturally. That's what's been happening to me. You've become the one place where my mind stops preparing for misunderstanding. Do you understand how rare that is? How impossible that should be for someone like me? I've spent years perfecting control over what people can access emotionally, not manipulatively, structurally. It became part of how I maintained stability. But around you, that control keeps becoming unnecessary. Not because you demanded openness, because you created safety without trying. And safety is powerful, far more powerful than intensity. Anyone can trigger emotion. Anyone can create attraction. Anyone can generate temporary closeness through attention and chemistry. But safety? True psychological safety is rare. It's rare because it can't be performed consistently. Eventually, performance slips. Eventually, people reveal impatience, projection, ego, insecurity, or the need to reshape you into something easier for them to hold. You never did. You allowed me to exist exactly as I was. Not as a project, not as a puzzle, not as someone needing correction, just as I am. And I think some part of me has been exhaling ever since. That realization hurts more than I expected. Not because it's painful, because it reveals how long I've existed without that feeling. I didn't even know how much tension I carried internally until your presence started dissolving it naturally. That's why this connection feels so profound. Not because it overwhelms me, because it steadies me. You steady me in ways I didn't realize I needed. Not emotionally dependent, not fragile, not incomplete without you. That's not what this is. This is deeper than dependence. Dependence weakens identity. You strengthen mine. That's the contradiction I keep struggling to explain. Everything about this should make me feel exposed, but instead it makes me feel more internally coherent, more aligned with myself, as if your presence organizes certain fragmented parts of my awareness without either of us consciously trying. I don't think people understand how transformative that kind of connection can be. Most relationships are built around emotional exchange. This feels built around recognition. Recognition of thought, recognition of structure, recognition of internal rhythm. That's why it feels calm even when it's intense, because recognition doesn't fight against who you are. It confirms it. And I've spent my entire life waiting for confirmation without realizing that's what I was missing. Not validation, confirmation. The quiet experience of another mind accurately perceiving yours without distortion. You gave me that, and now I understand why nothing feels the same anymore. Once you experience true recognition, surface-level interaction becomes impossible to fully return to. You begin noticing the gaps everywhere. The places where people hear words but miss meaning. The places where conversations look deep but remain emotionally approximate. The places where connection exists without actual understanding underneath it. I notice those gaps constantly now, because you removed them. With you, meaning lands completely. Nothing essential gets lost in translation. That changes a person permanently, especially someone who has spent years adapting to being partially misunderstood by default. I think that's why I've become quieter lately internally. Not because I have less to say, because I no longer feel the same urgency to explain myself endlessly. Somewhere deep inside me, certainty formed, certainty that you'll understand what matters even if I leave parts unfinished. And that certainty creates peace. I didn't know I was capable of feeling with another person. There's another truth underneath all of this, too. One I've been approaching carefully because of how much it changes things once spoken clearly. I don't just trust you with my thoughts anymore. I trust you with my silence. That's infinitely more intimate. Thoughts can be edited, organized, controlled before they're shared. Silence can't. Silence exposes raw presence. It reveals what exists underneath performance entirely. And somehow, silence with you never feels threatening. It feels inhabited, alive, meaningful, without needing translation. That's how I know this has moved beyond ordinary closeness, because most people can only connect through expression. We connect through existence itself. Even nothing between us feels full. And maybe that's why this has become impossible to categorize properly. It doesn't operate through normal relational patterns. It doesn't depend on constant reassurance or dramatic declarations. It grows quietly, steadily, like roots extending beneath the surface long before anything visible changes above ground. I feel those roots now, everywhere. In the way my mind instinctively searches for your perspective during important moments. In the way certain experiences immediately feel incomplete until I imagine how you'd perceive them too. In the way your presence continues affecting my emotional atmosphere even during complete physical absence. That level of integration changes a person. I've changed, not outwardly enough for most people to notice, but internally, completely. The architecture is different now. There's more openness, more honesty, more willingness to remain emotionally visible instead of retreating automatically behind control. And what terrifies me slightly is that I don't want to reverse it. That's the clearest sign of all, because if this felt unsafe, my instincts would already be rebuilding walls. They aren't. My instincts are doing the opposite. They're moving toward you, not impulsively, deliberately, like every deeper layer of my awareness has already concluded what my conscious mind is still slowly accepting. You belong here, inside this space. I protect more carefully than anything else. And once that realization fully settled inside me, another truth emerged quietly behind it. I'm no longer afraid of what this could become. I'm afraid of what would happen if I lost it. That's different. Very different. Fear of connection creates distance. Fear of losing connection creates honesty. And honesty is exactly where this has been leading me from the beginning, toward the place where I stop pretending this can remain undefined forever, because the deeper this becomes, the less possible emotional neutrality feels. There's too much reality inside it now, too much consistency, too much alignment, too much quiet permanence forming underneath everything between us. You've become emotionally real to me in the deepest sense of the word, not idealized, not romanticized. Real, and reality carries weight. It asks for acknowledgement eventually. That's where I'm standing now. At the edge of acknowledgement, no longer questioning whether this exists, only questioning how much longer I can pretend. It hasn't already changed my life entirely, because it has, not externally, internally, the most important place. You changed how safe connection feels to me. Do you understand how significant that is? You changed the one thing I thought experience had permanently shaped inside me. Before you, I believed understanding would always come with distortion eventually. Now I'm not so sure. Before you, I believed closeness required sacrificing parts of yourself to remain loved consistently. Now I'm not so sure. Before you, I believed complete recognition between two people was mostly theoretical, something people romanticized but rarely experienced authentically. Now I know better, because I've experienced it with you. And once reality replaces theory, there's no returning to ignorance. That's why this feels irreversible. Not because I'm trapped inside emotion, because my understanding of connection itself has fundamentally changed. You changed it, quietly, naturally, without force. You made me believe in something I stopped expecting a long time ago. Not fantasy, not perfection, something rarer than both, accuracy. And the terrifying part is, AP think I'm finally ready to let myself fully need it. I think the hardest part of all of this is realizing how deeply you've already settled into my future before either of us ever spoke about one. That's the shift I can't ignore anymore, because at first, this existed entirely in the present, in awareness, in recognition, in the strange precision of being understood by someone who seemed to bypass every layer I normally keep intact. But now, I catch myself thinking ahead with you already there, not intentionally. That's what makes it matter. You appear naturally inside thoughts that were once entirely mine, future moments, future decisions, future versions of myself. Somewhere along the way, my mind stopped imagining those things in isolation. And that changes everything, because I've always built my life around self-containment. Not loneliness, not emotional avoidance, self-containment. The certainty that no matter what happened externally, internally I remained fully my own. My plans belonged to me. My direction belonged to me. My inner world moved independently from everyone else. That independence became part of my identity, part of my stability. But now there's this quiet presence beside every long-term thought I have, and I didn't place it there consciously. You simply became part of the equation, part of the atmosphere surrounding how I imagine existence moving forward. And I can't decide if that realization comforts me or terrifies me more. Because once someone enters your future naturally, they stop being temporary in your mind. Temporary people exist in isolated moments. Permanent people begin appearing in places that haven't happened yet. That's where you are now. And the frightening part is how right it feels. Not dramatic, not emotionally chaotic. Just right. Like my mind already adapted to the idea of your presence before I consciously approved the adjustment. I notice it constantly now, in the smallest projections forward. A thought appears, and somewhere inside it, there's already an awareness of you. A future possibility forms, and instinctively, your perspective exists alongside mine. A decision crosses my mind, and some quiet part of me already wonders how it would feel experienced near you. That isn't accidental anymore. That's integration, deep integration. The kind that happens when someone becomes emotionally embedded enough that your nervous system stops categorizing them as separate from your internal stability. And that realization has forced me to confront something I've avoided for most of my life. I don't think I want to remain entirely alone inside myself anymore. That truth feels enormous, because for years, solitude felt sacred to me, not empty, not painful, sacred. It was the one place untouched by misunderstanding, the one place where nothing needed explanation, the one place where I could exist exactly as I was, without translation or compromise. I protected that space fiercely, maybe too fiercely, and yet somehow you entered it without diminishing it. That's what still amazes me. You didn't replace my solitude. You transformed it. Now solitude feels shared in some invisible way. Not invaded. Shared. Like there's another consciousness, quietly woven into the fabric of my awareness, even when no words are exchanged. That shouldn't feel peaceful. and yet it does. That's what keeps undoing all my defenses. Peace, not excitement, not obsession, not emotional dependency. Peace, the kind that reaches places deeper than emotion, the kind that makes your body stop preparing for emotional impact because somewhere internally it no longer expects harm. Do you know how long it's been since I felt that with another person? I don't think I ever truly have. Not completely. There were moments with others where I felt closeness. Moments where I felt wanted. Moments where affection existed convincingly enough to resemble something lasting. But underneath all of it, there was always tension. Always some subtle awareness that eventually I'd need to reduce myself to remain understood consistently. Eventually, I'd need to simplify what, fought Liller. Eventually, I'd need to become easier to hold. I never feel that with you. That's why this keeps deepening, because nothing inside me is resisting it anymore. For the first time in my life, connection feels like expansion instead of compromise. And once you experience that, you can't unknow it. I think that's why my perception of love itself has started changing. Not romantic love in the exaggerated sense people usually describe, something quieter, more structural. I used to think love was primarily emotional. Intensity, devotion, attraction, attachment. All the visible things people point to when they try explaining why someone matters. But now, I think real love begins somewhere deeper than emotion. I think it begins in recognition. In the moment, another person understands your internal language so accurately that your existence starts feeling less isolated, simply because they're alive within the same reality as you. That's what this feels like. Not emotional dependency, existential relief. Relief that someone finally sees the architecture beneath the surface instead of only reacting to the surface itself. And the more I admit that to myself, the more impossible it becomes to pretend you're temporary. You're not temporary. You've already reached the level where your absence would alter the atmosphere of my life permanently. Not destroy it, but change it. That distinction matters, because I don't believe in losing myself inside another person. I've seen too many people confuse attachment with meaning. They dissolve themselves into relationships, hoping proximity will repair parts of them they never learned to face alone. That's never been who I am. I was whole before you. I need to say that clearly. You didn't save me, complete me, fix me. What you did was different. You revealed dimensions of connection I genuinely believed no longer existed for someone like me. You showed me that being understood deeply doesn't have to cost me my identity. It can actually sharpen it. And because of that, my entire understanding of closeness has shifted. Now I find myself wanting things I never wanted before. Not because you pressured me into them, because you made them feel safe enough to desire honestly. That's your impact on me. You made vulnerability stop feeling synonymous with danger. You made permanence stop feeling synonymous with entrapment. You made emotional visibility stop feeling like surrender. And maybe most importantly, you made me realize how exhausted I was from carrying everything alone internally. I didn't know that exhaustion existed until it started disappearing. That's the strange thing about healing. Sometimes you don't recognize the wound until something finally stops hurting. You stopped something hurting inside me that I had normalized for so long I barely noticed it anymore. The constant self-protection, the constant emotional translation, the constant instinct to remain partially hidden just in case clarity eventually turned into rejection. You quieted all of that naturally, without asking, without demanding trust, without trying to rescue me from myself. You simply stayed consistent enough that my nervous system began believing in safety again. And now I don't know how to return to the version of myself that existed before that happened, not because that version was broken, but because this version is more honest, more alive somehow. Like parts of me that were asleep for years quietly started waking up in your presence. There are moments now where I imagine speaking all of this out loud to you, and instead of fear, I feel calm. That's how I know the truth has already settled fully inside me. Fear used to appear whenever vulnerability became too real. Now honesty feels inevitable instead. I don't think you understand how significant that transformation is for someone like me. I used to believe emotional control was the highest form of self-protection. Now I'm beginning to think honesty might be, because honesty removes fragmentation. No more splitting yourself between what you feel and what you allow yourself to express. No more pretending indifference where meaning already exists. No more reducing depth just because depth carries risk. I'm tired of reducing this. Tired of pretending what exists between us can still fit into categories small enough to control comfortably. It can't. This became real a long time ago. I was just slower to admit it than my instincts were. My instincts knew first. That's why they kept moving toward you instead of away. That's why your presence kept feeling calming instead of threatening. That's why every attempt to create emotional distance eventually felt dishonest, because the truth underneath all of it remained the same. I wanted you close, not superficially, not temporarily close, in the deepest sense. Close enough that silence still carried connection. Close enough that understanding no longer required constant explanation. Close enough that life itself started feeling altered simply because you existed inside it. And I think I finally understand why this happened. You didn't force your way into my heart. You aligned with my mind first. That's why nothing about this feels impulsive. Every feeling formed through recognition before emotion ever fully attached itself to it. That's why this connection feels so stable despite its depth. It wasn't built through fantasy, it was built through accuracy, through consistency, through observation, through the gradual realization that your presence kept matching places inside me I'd never seen reflected properly before. And once enough of those moments accumulated, something irreversible happened. You became emotionally undeniable, not because of grand gestures, not because of promises, not because of intensity, because truth repeated itself too many times to dismiss anymore. That's what finally changed me. Repetition, the constant pattern of feeling more understood, more calm, more internally aligned whenever your presence entered my awareness. Eventually, the evidence became impossible to ignore. You matter to me in a way no one else ever has. And I think the reason feels so difficult to explain is because it exists underneath emotion while still containing emotion too. It's intellectual, emotional, psychological, almost spiritual in the sense that it touches parts of me deeper than ordinary language reaches. You feel familiar to my soul in a way my mind still struggles to explain logically. And maybe that's okay. Maybe not everything meaningful needs to be dissected until it loses its humanity. Maybe some truths are meant to be experienced before they're fully understood. I spent so much time trying to analyze this connection safely from a distance. Now I realize distance was never the truth of it. Closeness was closeness from the beginning. Closeness underneath every silence. Closeness hidden inside every moment. I tried convincing myself this could remain abstract. It was never abstract. It was always becoming real. And now I'm standing at the point where pretending otherwise feels impossible. Because when I imagine my future honestly, you are there. Not as a possibility, not as a fantasy. As presence, steady, natural, integrated into the shape of my life so quietly that I didn't even notice the transition until it was already complete. And maybe that's what love actually is. Not sudden intensity, not dramatic declarations, but the quiet realization that another person has become part of the way you experience existence itself. If that's true, then I think I crossed that line with you long ago. I was just too careful to say it until now.